Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was March 26th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We are looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. So, you know how a couple days ago we were looking at a document about how Joan needed to raise money to get soldiers to go to Sardinia to combat some of the resistance of the Sardinians against Catalan rule? Okay, well, that costed some money, and he was worried that he wouldn't get the funding to pay those soldiers. There was a lot of urgency in that letter. Well, here we are a couple days later, and Joan is writing to the royal Procurador in Mallorca, and it's on a completely different topic, and he doesn't really say anything about the money specifically, but I mean, he basically says, whatever you need to obtain these things, I will be providing to you. You know, totes aquellas provisiones que sean necessaris per que venguen totes. Right? And so he's like, I am going to send you whatever provisions you need in order to buy all these things. And what is it that is getting purchased with money, who knows from where, is a bunch of cool hunting bird stuff and something that ties in to an extremely famous mappa mundi, a map of the world. All right. It's so fun to talk about these things that I don't even know which one to do first. Well, Joan starts out with the birds. So this is a really difficult thing to figure out what he's talking about exactly, like what kind of bird. He uses the word gallines de India. So it's like, I mean, the word is like chicken. It's like chickens from India. But I don't think he's like all that excited about chickens. I think it's some kind of like other bird, like a hunting bird, like not falcons, because he uses falcons later on in the letter. So I don't know exactly what type of hunting bird he has in mind, but I'm pretty sure it's a hunting bird. So he is writing to the Procurador, Procurator. God, I'm having trouble saying it in English now. The Procurador, and he's saying, you have to send the 3 pairs of birds of India. There's some birds that have arrived from India, and 2 of them are male. Well, maybe he's heard that there's a bunch of birds, and this is the quantity he wants. He wants 3 pairs, and he wants at least 2 males. So that's how he starts the letter. You know, send me these birds that I've heard about that have come into Mallorca from India. So right there, we have really interesting revelations that Joan receives information about the kind of stuff that arrives to Mallorca. We already got that. I mean, earlier I guess it was maybe a couple weeks ago, he had verified that he had received a whole bunch of treasures from Mallorca, including sapphires and all kinds of gold stuff and cool textiles and carpets. So we know that he's a frequent shopper when it comes to the cool stuff that arrives in Mallorca. But what's neat is that we have this claim that there are birds that have come from India. And of course, what does the word India mean in this context? It could just mean from far away. It could mean Silk Road. It's not necessarily claiming the actual place of India that we would know today. But it is interesting that there's a possibility, and it's definitely the case that Catalan merchants made it into the Red Sea and the Arabian Sea, and so it is definitely a possibility that when Joan is talking about these birds from India, that they actually did come from India, someplace like Goa, for example, or maybe even further south, someplace like Kochi. All right, now let's move on to the next part of the letter. This is exciting. The name Cresques comes up. So, and also he's identified as a Jew. So, Cresques Heu. All right, the Jew Cresques. So already we've got interfaith context coming up here. So let me just read it out. All right. E com hayam antes, we have understanding, que Cresques Yehu, qui fahia a nos un mappa mundi, es mort. So he has found out that this Jew named Cresques, who was making a world map for Joan, has died. So this is a reference to actually someone that's very famous, one of the most reproduced maps of this era, a Portolan map made by Cresques, is known as the Catalan Atlas. It is currently in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And actually, I had the opportunity to go look at it myself. And so I think I'm going to post a selfie that I took with the Catalan Atlas in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris onto the webpage for today's document. This map, and I'll put a couple different images on it, is often reproduced in world history textbooks these days because it demonstrates the connectivity all across the Mediterranean in the kind of trade networks with the Saharan trade networks and all the way into the Silk Road. So basically, it's got a lot of little passages and details and illustrations. It's a beautiful work. Now, I don't think that the actual Catalan Atlas that survived to this day and is reproduced so much is the one that Joan is referring to here. That particular map made by Cresques is one that he was commissioned to create for Charles V of France. And that was before 1380. So Cresques was making maps for a lot of high-profile clients. It is true that he had been appointed to a royal position for the Crown of Aragon, and he lived in Mallorca this whole time. And so he had additional funding in order to increase the productivity of his workshop and for all the materials. At this time, Mallorca hosted this map making school. It's actually called the Mallorcan Cartographic School. And there's a little Wikipedia page about it that I'll link to on the webpage for this episode. The Mallorcan Cartographic School produced Portolan chart maps, and there's a bit of a debate about whether it was the Genoese or these Mallorcans who invented Portolan charts. When we say Portolan, we're talking about the custom in map making where there's all these straight lines, these diagonal straight lines that are kind of connected in like intersections, so it looks like a bunch of like stars in a way. So that's Portolan map making, and it's an invention that really aids in navigation. And so it's possible that the creators of that were these Mallorcan cartographers, but it's up for debate. It could have been the cartographers in Genoa that invented that. But the important thing to understand about this Mallorcan cartographic school is that they were almost all Jewish. So it was the Jewish community in Mallorca that gave rise to this group of artisan map makers, and they were renowned all over Europe. So they supplied maps to royals all over the place. And indeed, part of the launching of Portugal into major power player status in the long distance trade that was happening in the 15th century can be traced back to how the King of Portugal recruited cartographers from Mallorca to move to Lisbon and to help start out a greater understanding of cartography and navigation. So these maps and these particular map makers are really important for the trajectory of Europe as a whole. And here we have Joan seeking out a product from that particular school. It's not clear which map this was or whether it currently survives. The Wikipedia page, which I know is not authoritative, and I'm going to talk about that in just a bit, but the Wikipedia page for Cresques, for Abraham Cresques, lists a bunch of his maps that do survive, and none of them are currently in Spain. So they're held in libraries in other places, like I think there's one in Florence, for example. So word of caution, when you look at the Wikipedia pages for the Mallorcan Cartographic School, for Abraham Cresques, for his son, Yehuda Cresques, and for the Catalan Atlas, there's a lot of inaccuracies on these Wikipedia pages. Generally speaking, they will give you an accurate idea of what the importance of all of this was, culturally and economically. But there are small details that are again and again being repeated on these Wikipedia pages that are incorrect. So at one point, Joan is linked to Abraham Cresques in a way that is not possible. So here, we have documentation in today's document from the archive of the Crown of Aragon that Abraham Cresques had died around 1387 or maybe late 1386, and stuff on the Wikipedia page makes it seem like he was still alive into the 1390s. So obviously someone there creating those pages is getting confused, and maybe some secondary sources have gotten confused, but we are absolutely sure that Joan is not mistaken at this point. There's plenty of documentation later on too. And actually in July, we're going to look at a document where Joan is referring to Abraham Cresques' son, Yehuda. So it's pretty clear that Abraham Cresques died in late 1396 or around, not 1386 or 1387. Okay, so basically Joan is interested in getting a mappa mundi. There were a lot of medieval elites that wanted to look at mappa mundis, maps of the world, and for obvious reasons, they're really interesting. And Joan was definitely somebody who was a acquirer of knowledge and culture, and these world maps, I'm sure, would have been a great joy for him to peruse. And I am quite confident in saying that he would have shared this with Violante. Okay, let's talk about what else is covered in this letter. So Joan has heard that Abraham Cresques has died, and so Joan is concerned about getting his map that he had commissioned. And so he says if it's not finished, then there is a Christian here in Barcelona that I know who would be able to finish it, so just send it. So that's what he says to his Procurador in Mallorca. And then he goes back to another topic of another product that he's wanting to get from Mallorca, falcons. So he talks about falcon. He was really into falconry, and there's just a whole gigantic literature about falconry. I think I've talked about it once before on the podcast. Falcons are not efficient for obtaining prey for like cooking, like for eating. It just takes a long time to train them, and what they get is not anything that's, big. So if you're really concerned about hunting for the reasons of nourishment, then falcons are not the way to go. But if you are instead excited by watching a falcon hunt its prey by swooping around in the sky, and you have a lot of spare time on your hands to train them, or have a staff of people to train them, meaning you're wealthy, then in the Middle Ages, you love some falcons. And there were a lot of falconers, and there were, going all the way back to, what's his face? Frederick in Sicily. What's his name? Frederick II, I think. He had like 50 different people working as falconers, and he knew them all by name. He's just loving his falcons. So there's definitely a lot of medieval elites that are just deep into falconry. I guess it's kind of exciting. And see him swooping around in the air and all that stuff. So anyway, Joan is really into falcons, and he mentions that there's some falcons that he would like his Procurador to obtain from Mallorca. I think it seems like they've been made in Mallorca, so native Mallorcan falcons. I don't know enough about falconry to know if that's like, the best falcons out there, the ones in Mallorca, maybe. So map makers and falconers. Mallorca's got it going on. All right, so I think that's pretty much it for today's document, but it's really great because it connects into a material object that you can go to see in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And while that's not exactly the same object that Joan looked at, you can be confident that as you look at the Catalan Atlas, it's known as the Catalan Atlas, that you were looking at something that Joan, very similar to the product that Joan himself and probably Violante too would have looked at with great interest as they were very curious about geography and the world, all the way back 639 years ago. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document, a whole bunch of images of the Catalan Atlas, made by Abraham Cresques, and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.